Okay, I think we're going to get started. Thank you so much for joining everyone our webinar on harnessing the transformative potential of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. This webinar is intended to sort of build on and carry forward the discussion that we started in the report that Climate Policy Initiative recently published on the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and its potential. My name is Chris Grant. I'm a senior manager here at CPI, and I'll just give a brief overview of the agenda, and then we'll get started. So we'll start with some introductory remarks from Mercedes Mortazavi at JP Morgan Chase. And then CPI's Matthew Solomon and Michelle Lee will give a brief presentation summarizing the report that we published that's available on our website. And then I will hand things over to Stuart Sarkozy-Banassi to moderate a panel discussion talking about sort of next steps and how the GGRF ecosystem can move forward into the implementation phase and collaborate going forward with our great panelists who are Dan Adler of the California Infrastructure and Economic Development Bank, Duan Andrade at the Solar Energy Loan Fund, and Jessel Amin at JP Morgan. So for opening remarks, I'm going to hand it to Mercedes Mortazavi, who is the Vice President for Global Philanthropy at JP Morgan Chase & Co. and a funder of CPI's work under this project, along with ClimateWorks Foundation. So Mercedes, thanks so much, and over to you.
Thank you, Chris. Hi, everyone. As Chris mentioned, Mercedes Mortazavi with JP Morgan Chase. I lead our housing affordability philanthropic portfolio nationally. And I'm really excited to kick this panel and webinar off. We've been thrilled to work with CPI and to be supporters of this work. And as you all know, there are so many different actors in this space. And really, when GGRF was announced, we set out to speak with all of our partners to understand what are all the barriers, what can we do, how can all these different actors play a role? And GGRF really gives us the opportunity to work together both across all these different sectors, but also issue areas. And it's been incredible to see not only everything we heard, but more outlined in this report in terms of all the barriers and solutions to make sure GGRF is really equitably deployed. In particular, JPMC's philanthropic sector across all of our teams, not just housing, but we've been partnered across our sustainability team, our small business team, our financial health team, our jobs and skills teams, really to support organizations in building out the data and expertise needed to ground this work, provide the capacity needed to organizations to directly apply to GGRF, as well as de-risk models to equitably absorb and deploy this type of capital. And not just for GGRF, we're really thinking about IRA writ large as well. So we're really looking forward to what's to come and see how JPMC can continue to be a partner on this work. I'm really looking forward to our panel today, and you'll hear more from the incredible panelists, including my colleague Jessel. But I just wanted to close out by highlighting some of the key solutions that CPI has outlined in this report that are really important to really ground us in this conversation. The 5 key components here: 1, again, coordination across stakeholders is key. 2, standardization of financial products to achieve the scale needed to attract private capital. Philanthropic support to de-risk some of these models and really pilot demonstration efforts. Alignment of public policy and incentives across levels of government. And finally, ongoing and continued efforts to share learnings, best practices, and outcomes across the GGRF ecosystem. And these are all going to be incredibly important. And I'm thrilled that we get to dig into these a little bit more in the discussion. So with that, I will pass it back to Chris.
Thank you so much, Mercedes. And I'll just add from CPI's perspective, we're of course very grateful for working with your team at JP Morgan, and just that JP Morgan has been sort of a great partner, of course, on the funding side, but then also on the sort of providing some really great insights to the analysis that we've done under this project. So, and I think you'll hear a little bit more about that. So with that, I will turn it over to Matthew Solomon, who's a senior analyst here at CPI, and Michelle Lee, who's an analyst at CPI, to give a presentation. This goes into a little bit more detail on the report that we've done following on Mercedes' introductory overview. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Chris. And thank you, Mercedes, for the introduction. And thank you all for joining us today to discuss our report. So on January 31st, almost a month ago, Climate Policy Initiative released a report called Harnessing the Transformative Potential of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Today, Michelle and I will walk through the major findings and recommendations of this report. This was informed by interviews with almost 24 organizations in the GGRF ecosystem, including GGRF applicants, CDFIs, green banks, federal and local government agencies, philanthropies, private financial institutions, and more, including many of you who are on the call today. So thank you for your input. So before getting into the recommendations that we have, I want to talk a little bit about the impact that the GGRF could have. So we think that the GGRF is a potentially transformative opportunity above and beyond just the scope of $27 billion in grants. So as you can see on this slide, this could result in, first off, an acceleration of progress to climate justice in communities across the US, including especially low-income and disadvantaged communities and tribes, a broader alignment of actors to spur economic and community development, leading to increased jobs and wealth, stronger resilience to climate change, and reduced negative impacts from pollution and poverty. And then, of course, emissions reductions. However, getting to that idealized future will not be necessarily straightforward and will require dedicated effort to overcome barriers, as we can see on this slide. So that includes, first off, a short time frame for GGRF implementation. I'm sure many of you are aware of this. It's been less than a year for coalitions to come together, apply for the GGRF, and then eventually absorb this capital. There's a diverse set of green banks and CDFIs who will be deploying these funds, and they don't necessarily share a common set of experiences or priorities. And then outside of just the green banks and CDFIs, there are a lot of other stakeholders in the ecosystem, including, again, many of you on the call today. Again, this includes federal, state, and local government agencies, private financial institutions, both large and small, local communities and community organizations, developers, contractors, et cetera. And then on top of these GGRF-specific challenges, there are many pre-existing barriers to project implementation that will need to be overcome for this impact to be realized. This includes workforce capacity and limited and uncertain project pipelines. So before getting into the proposed solutions for these challenges that Mercedes highlighted, I want to emphasize why getting this right is so important from a climate perspective, and also highlight another product that CPI released as part of this report. So as seen on this slide, in the GGRF priority project categories, which include distributed energy generation, zero emission transport, and zero emission buildings, we estimate that nationally we will need $9.1 trillion in climate investment through 2035, of which 2.8 trillion are in low income and disadvantaged communities. These are absolutely massive numbers, especially compared to the $27 billion GGRF program. So to help stakeholders allocate these dollars most effectively, we released a census tract level map of the US with estimated investment needs in the GGRF priority project categories. A screenshot of this map is on the left-hand side of the slide, and there's also a link available on our website, and we'll send that out after the presentation. The map also identifies census tracts that qualify as low-income and disadvantaged communities under the GGRF program's definition. We hope that this map can help participants in the ecosystem identify where the needs in their communities are greatest. We can also share a more detailed data set if that's of interest, so please reach out. So now that we're clear on the size of the need, what do we need to do to overcome the barriers I talked about and to accelerate climate justice and equitable resilience across the US? We've identified 5 key action areas outlined in the middle of this graphic, and now we'll go through them one by one. So the first pillar is catalyzing private capital at scale. The $27 billion in grants is a historic amount, but again, it pales in comparison to national needs. The good news is that there's a McKinsey analysis that projects that GGRF funding can be leveraged 12 times above its initial capitalization. So to actually achieve this and to get that much capital flowing into projects, our research suggests that the following steps will be necessary. First is building a robust secondary market where GGRF-supported loans can be traded between institutions, which would enable recycling of GGRF capital and more loans to be made with the same set of initial funds. Utilizing blended finance structures to maximize the value of GGRF funds and to crowd in private investment through de-risking from instruments like guarantees or loan loss funds. And then finally, expanding CDFI and green bank balance sheets by supplementing their own loss-absorbing capital, which enables them to borrow even more. The second pillar that we discussed is standardization, which would help achieve scale across the ecosystem, reduce costs for lenders and borrowers, and enable securitization financial structures that I just talked about. So a couple of examples of this include shared definitions for terms such as low-income and disadvantaged communities, term sheets and use cases that are shared widely and are available for free use, including from the small and CDFIs and green banks, shared underwriting criteria so that loans can be bundled together and sold to a larger financial institution, and so that GGRF funds can then be recycled into new projects. And then finally, standardized applications and reporting requirements so that applicants can spend more time actually building projects than applying for funds. Now I'll hand it to my colleague Michelle to take us through the final three pillars and our recommendations.
Great. So the third pillar we identified is coordinated and targeted technical assistance, which will ensure that the GGRF money is fully utilized, but also that communities are ready to absorb this unprecedented amount of capital. And so we see a lot of promise in a TA model that utilizes a hub and spoke approach, which will essentially merge the benefits of the localized specific supports that CDFIs and green banks and communities need, as well as the benefit of centralized coordination to share resources and reduce duplication. And so we think it's critical that TA be appropriately resourced, including resources that are targeted or earmarked to getting funding to communities that are the most marginalized by current funding structures. And so this is a key area where we see philanthropy playing a large role in supporting the GGRF ecosystem. And the fourth pillar we identified is enhanced government alignment at all levels, from federal to state and to local. We heard repeatedly throughout our research process that there are so many different government programs that have these overlapping incentives that align with the GGRF, but that it's very challenging to not only know about these programs, but to apply for them and braid together incentives. So we see a couple areas where we could, where there could be benefit of supporting this government aligning, including dedicated support for local governments to improve permitting and project development processes, which could include ensuring that local communities are part of the development process from the beginning, so the solutions benefit everyone. But also the importance of efforts that braid together different government incentives in a way that's easier for applicants to access and increases the impact of each individual funding source. And so this would require coordination with other levels of government and government agencies outside of the EPA as to how their programs could align with and supplement the GGRF. And so the final pillar we identified is a bit more holistic, but that's creating an ecosystem-wide culture of collaboration and learning. And so as we've mentioned at the start, the GGRF grants on their own are not enough to have the impact needed to reduce emissions in the US to net zero, in line with what's needed to keep warming to 1.5 degrees. And so therefore, the goal of how to use the GGRF is to make sure that it's efficiently able to enable speed and reach scale. And so this means that the ecosystem needs to be able to quickly learn from mistakes, identify what is and what is not working through data collection, and communicate that impact out. And so there are a few different methods we identified to doing this, including creating a centralized learning hub, developing innovation labs to address targeted challenges, and convening to transparently discuss what is working, what's not working, and how to address remaining barriers. And so I guess the question this ends with then is, how do we accomplish this? And so we're excited to hear what our panelists think about the question. But in the meantime, CPI identified 3 short-term actions that can be taken. The first is that the EPA and GGRF applicants and coalitions can proactively strategize about how the funds can be used most effectively, regardless of who wins funding. The second is that we should be investing in communities now to address the barriers and gaps to project implementation, so that when the funding is available, projects can kick off immediately and equitably. And the third is that the entire ecosystem should start planning for the supporting platforms that will be needed to ensure the GGRF is impactful, efficient, and durable. And so with that, I'll pass back to my colleague, Chris Grant, and we can get started on our panel discussion.
Thanks so much, Michelle and Matthew. So yeah, as Michelle mentioned, now we'll move forward to the main event, which is what we hope will be a really interesting panel discussion. We've got a great set of panelists that represent a range of perspectives from within the GGRF ecosystem. First, we have, in alphabetical order, at least first, we have Dan Adler, who's the Deputy Director for Climate Finance at the California Infrastructure and Economic Development Bank, or IBank. We also have Jessel Amin, who is an Executive Director and Senior Commercial Banker in the Community Development Banking Intermediaries Lending area at JP Morgan. And last but not least, we have Duan Andrade, who is the executive director at the Solar Energy Loan Fund. Our moderator is Stuart Sarkozy-Banasy, who's the founder of Precovery Labs, a member of the board of directors of the Four Bands Community Fund, and a member of the NBN Fund Loan Committee and Steering Committee, and also a co-author of our report on this project. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. And with that, I'll hand it over. Oh, sorry, one other thing on Q&A. We will have a Q&A at the end of this presentation, or at the end of the discussion. So if anyone has any questions you'd like to ask, please add them in the Q&A area at the bottom of your Zoom window. And then after the discussion, we'll read out the questions to the panelists for them to answer. So thanks, and Stuart, over to you.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thank you to Mercedes and Matthew and Michelle for setting us up. And it's great to see so many familiar names in our audience today from all aspects of what may be the future of GGRF and related programs. Special thanks and welcome from me, and also a thank you to the CPI team for the partnership that occurred for this research and the report, actually both reports. We are very close to being right on time, and so as Chris said, we will take the Q&A questions through the platform as we do the first set of questions that I have for the panelists, and then we'll come back to them and then wrap it up at the very end and try to end right on time. And I'll say we're super excited to jump into the panel and further dissect what we have for opportunities and challenges and some of what was already been set up. And I know everyone is holding their breath, including a number of you that are on the call for the GGRF announcements, and that includes some of our panelists as well. And I would say, as one of the authors, but also as somebody who's worked for 25 years in the CDFI field, and another hat that is in deeper resilience overall, this is an incredibly interesting inflection point for the industry, for CDFIs and green banks. But I think for the more holistic view too, beyond GGRF, it's super interesting, and it'll be interesting to hear what our panelists have to say for our Q&A. Thanks again to them, to Jessel, Dan, and Duan. And I'm going to first move to Duan and Dan to consider this question. What are going to be your organization's primary or immediate priorities once the awards are announced? And what are the kinds of relationships with organizations in the GGRF ecosystem do you want to build within those first few months of GGRF implementation? And I think, Duan, we'll go to you, and then Dan, over to you.
Great, thank you, and hello, everyone. It's great to be here with you, and particularly want to thank CPI and everybody for having Self here at the table. Well, I think that priorities, once we hear the announcements, for us will be, number one, really turbo charge capacity building. I mean, what I mean by that is we obviously already have identified kind of those positions that we need to fill those gaps. You know, one of the biggest exercises that we've been going back and forth on seems so simple: organizational structure. What do we need in place in the organization? There's always that balance between staffing up too much ahead of time and not staffing up enough, you know, and so I think that's one of the major tension points for us, is how do we build our capacity in an adequate way? I think the second thing is understanding clearly the allocation of funds, how they will flow. Because we've talked about this, but nobody really has a clear idea of how those funds will flow, right? So we all want to know, okay, what's going to happen? How are we going to get the funds? When are we going to get the funds? We all talk about July, the funds flowing from EPA to the prime coalitions, but what does that mean for us, the actual boots on the ground? Another thing would be for us really understanding how we're going to manage federal compliance and reporting, right? So right now, and until those announcements, we're in conversations about maybe aggregating a group, and that's using the Climate Accelerator or whatever green bank groups that we have to not have to each one of us, hire consultants to help us get through these policies, right? So how do we have these policy and compliance rules in a way that makes sense, that's not, and that we can all kind of build on? And I guess the almost last thing, kicking off advisory boards. So advisory committees and boards have become another important topic of focus for us, because we're going to need that external help in a way in which we don't need to hire, but in a way that we can tap into experience and brains. And the last thing is obviously, I say obviously, but the local government partnerships is really reaching out to them, engaging with them, and letting them know with more certainty, this is how much funding we will have available for communities. Now, let's figure out how to get the word out, how to build that pipeline quickly, and how to get ready to really deploy those funds.
Great, thanks.
Dan,
Dan, we'll go. Dan, we'll go to you. But I mean, I'm glad you brought up the government aspect, especially the cities and local government. That's obviously a place where this particular amount of funding and the kind that it includes is really going to have an overlay, and that maybe CDFIs have not played around with before. So Dan, over to you to add to that.
Thank you, Stuart. Let me say also thanks to CPI for another great product. It's always hugely beneficial to us on the state side. Understand the gaps in the financing market to date. Associate myself with everything Duan says as usual, and a couple of extra observations. At the end of last year, we issued an RFI, kind of an open standing request for input on how to structure our work in this effort on a couple of different levels. One would be the direct lending. What sort of products, capital market products, do borrowers need out there in the world? And the second piece, more challenging and maybe more important, is in the realm of what we're calling platform partners. There are a bunch of different ways to frame it. How do we move capital to folks who can originate and close transactions of the sort that GGRF calls for, distributed, equity focused, and multiple, really quickly over time? We don't want to be a bottleneck in that exercise. So we're looking at transactional structures that let us be a conduit as much as a direct lender when that's appropriate to do so. That RFI will remain open, probably indefinitely, just getting guidance from market actors about how we can be most useful as a state green bank. But the things that we're focused on in that period, hopefully between March and July, there's a lot that we don't know. The NOFO and the guidance and the sort of drip feeding of information from USCPA has left really more questions than answers on some really important structuring issues that will, they're technical in the finance sense, but they're hugely important as to how we can actually mobilize money for community level assets. So in that period, we're going to try and stick to what we've articulated as our principles and their flexibility and timing. Everybody wants to move quickly, but there are a lot of reasons to take our time to build a new system that can last for a long time and be flexible. So we want maximum flexibility, and we'll keep pushing for that, hopefully with allies across green banks and CDFIs. Capital costs should be low and as frictionless as possible. You'd think that would be a shared principle, but we'll see how the lead recipients at the national level actually want to work with local lenders on that basis. It needs to be consistent with our state policy priorities. California has done a lot. We have a lot of other needs, and so the money should be flexible based on how states articulate climate objectives with an equity emphasis. And the scale should be consistent with what our markets are faced with in the state. And I think that's fair across the country. The second key piece for us is the origination pathway. And how do we think about that actually generating deal flow in view of the new guidance that we're all waiting for from EPA? Cost of capital, the level of technical assistance that we can actually provide. It's hugely important that we get this buffer, this cushion, this grant type equity to develop markets and get that in place, because that's going to be the thing that we all live off of, frankly, as lenders. So we need to get that origination pathway actually articulated once we have more guidance from EPA about what we can do and how we can engage. And then the last one is really this tension between immediate action and building over time. It's overused, but this, go slow to go far, or go together to go far. We need to set this up right at this moment in time so that capital markets can evolve alongside us. I think that's central to what CPI has articulated about the standardization work and how this money is kind of a lot, but really not really. We need to get this moving and then move out of the way. And there are models in like the Fannie and Freddie world that are worth lingering over, but we need time to do that. And so obviously we want to be responsive to what everybody's asking us for in the RFI. everybody wants something bespoke and highly favorable, and we'd love to do that. But ultimately, this thing has to be standardized, has to be efficient, and get to scale in the right time frame quickly if we can. But if it takes a little bit longer, I think we need to. Obviously, the politics are hugely important. We need to insulate ourselves from them. But standardization is everybody's sort of saw, but we don't know what that looks like now. Not in California, at least, because there's so much churn on technologies and on origination and on what communities want. We could offer a standard product now that no one would like, or maybe we do a few deals and then you can't actually take that to the capital markets because you rushed into a standardization framework that's not actually market informed. So we need to be able to pace ourselves appropriately with all the right amount of urgency. But still, this is a transformational opportunity only insofar as we get it right at the early stages. So those are some of the issues we're going to be wrestling with, hopefully in advance of July and real funding coming our way.
Yeah, I think that's great, and it echoes a lot of what we heard in the interviews. And I'm glad you mentioned the systemic piece of it, because obviously, while this puts a sense of urgency behind the kinds of things that you're describing and Dewan described, both from the project level all the way up to kind of the full governance and sort of policy level, this is only one strain of funding, right, that's coming down, and it's only from one agency, and it's only one part of that layer cake or the capital stack that we want to see. So I think it starts to push us in the right direction. But we heard this from a lot of the interviewees, which is why the recommendations came out the way they did, in terms of like how we shift the whole system fast, sort of, right, without killing ourselves as CDFIs, because that's what we heard a lot of. And one way of doing that, right, is to really start to pilot the kinds of things that could do this. And I think I want to shift and go back to you, Dewan, and talk about your Southern Climate Equity Accelerator. That's something that self-launched in 2023. And it's targeting green banks and CDFIs and facilitating access to technical assistance and capital, and kind of trying to bring those worlds together a little bit ahead of time, right? For the very same thing that we're going to need to see at scale, whatever that may mean, to Dan's point, right? Like that could be small scale and large scale, depending on the CDFIs and green banks that are involved. So what are the lessons you've learned in trying to start that already for the South and Southeast? And what are the kinds of things that the GGRF awardees and other organizations can do to deploy TA, deploy the financing, and sort of bring those GGR funds into a way that sort of doesn't leave groups behind, doesn't leave communities behind. So would love to hear that specific example from you as related to that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the Southern Plus Climate Accelerator that we launched, it became Plus because when we thought about the South and the danger of the South being left behind again, because of lack of policy, because of lack of existing lenders in the space other than SELF that is 100% dedicated to this, we felt that urgency to do something about it, meaning to say, okay, we've been around for 11 years, we've survived barely, but here we are. And now we're at this historic opportunity. We want to make sure that we don't get left behind. And, Dan mentioned everything was a great point, but I mean, lots of things that really resonate. And one is that, California has policies, has a lot going on, right? But it's also diverse. Not everything is the same across, not every community has the same needs. We'll take that scenario and just like spread that across the South, right? We don't have policies and in some places you can do net metering, other no, we can't do PPAs, you can. So this idea of scaling with standardized products is great, is ideal. But will it work everywhere? So my fear has always been myself and for self, has been that we get these standardized blanket solutions and they don't work for us. So that's what motivated us, and literally a sense of anxiety over this whole potentially missed opportunity. So reaching out to funders, this is also where I want to highlight the role that philanthropy can play in this whole, kind of ecosystem. Reached out to JP Morgan Chase and thankfully, and a big shout out to Mercedes and the team, but they saw the vision, kind of like, we need to provide technical assistance and a customized service to the South so that we can prepare. Well, it turns out that it wasn't only the South. Then Nevada said, we need help too. And then we have Nebraska and Arizona, and people were raising their hands. So that's why it became Southern Plus, and we're just going to drop the Southern eventually. Point is that the lessons learned, number one, is that we need that philanthropic help, that investment up front. JP Morgan Chase funded the Southern Climate Equity Initiative, but also is providing sufficient flexibility for us to manage those funds in a way that makes the most sense. And what does that mean? We thought we need to provide technical assistance. I really hate that term because it's so broad, it doesn't mean anything. So I would say just like, we need to provide tools. We need to provide training. And basically, we need to provide what the market needs. So let's hear what they need. After a while, what we learned is that, number one, everyone's really nervous and anxious about this. Number two is that the lack of internal capacity of all the CDFIs across the region, the ones that haven't had experience in nascent green banks, et cetera, is not something you can solve for ahead of time because there is no funding for building that capacity. How do you develop new programs? How do you, create, like, who do you send for training to underwriting on green projects when you have your plate full with scarce resources already? Because as nonprofits, we're always working with scarce resources. So that's one of the things that we noticed immediately. So we wanted to make sure that we added value and not just repeated what others potentially were doing. Great other organizations, CARSI and Milliken and OFN, just to name a few, right? You guys, CPI. So we wanted to make sure that we were kind of customizing that training. Again, we can train on underwriting, but then the question is, who's going to do it internally? So to Dan's point, thinking about how we provide platforms as a service, how we provide services so that they can use their installed capacity. Those CDFIs and nascent green banks can use their installed capacity to do like origination or project management. What does that mean for us? If you're in Nevada or in Texas, you're there, you can recruit your contractors, you can go check out a project, you can interact with the local government. Let us take care of the underwriting. Let us take care of, everything else for you, and let's share the revenue, at least until you have enough capacity to build out your own programs. So we learned that we had to facilitate tools, that we had to really focus more on like case studies that they could relate to. Things that are relatable. And I think that what we came up with was, in the end, that what we have to do is aggregate solutions for the group, like not expect everybody to go out and find their own tracking and this and that, but kind of aggregate all that to be able to create efficiencies. We have to facilitate mapping tools and reporting and data, because from the prime applicants all the way down to communities, it most likely it will not get there if we don't play a role in that process. So through the accelerator, we're also rolling out specific tools. So like FinTech as a service, not a software, but a service. Again, you originate, use your capacity, and then we start to build your experience and get you comfortable. The other thing, which is really important to keep in mind, is that not every organization has to like pivot and completely focus on climate lending. Instead, they should do what they know how to do, whether it's business lending, housing, whatever, and incorporate and add in climate in a way that makes sense. And how do we do that? How do we help facilitate? So I think the key word is facilitate and enable them to participate in a way that makes sense for them. And then we can scale. And then us that are already in the space and have some more experience, which by the way, we're also learning new products and new services. But we can play that role of just providing like our FinTech white label. We just want to be behind you as a motor and have a shared revenue model. So I think, again, Dan was mentioning this idea of having them originate, but not just like, oh, originate for us, originate for yourself. We'll provide the tools, we'll help elevate that. And,
Yeah.
you know, just the challenges are hard, but I think that that's what we should do. All of us green banks and green lenders need to facilitate to reach communities. Otherwise, the communities, low income communities, will get left behind again.
Yeah, yeah, and you just hit on the thing that I was going to turn to Jessel about, and that is how do we get CDFIs and green banks who are in the position you're describing, right, and needing that support, effectively able to bring private co-financing for GGRF projects and sort of beyond, because again, this is not just GGRF, right? This is a sort of systemic shift that we see. And Dawn, you know this from the tool work that we're doing with CARSI. So Jessel, like, how do we move so many other types of investors into the space, and how do CDFIs and green banks bring the JP Morgan Chases and many others along? And what do you all need? I know you can't answer for everyone, but what do you need to enter this space and to do more, given the circumstances that you're hearing from Dawn and Dan?
Yeah, well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to CPI for the invitation to this really important conversation. As we heard Matthew and Michelle share, earlier on in the webinar, the GGRF's third sort of program objective is really around mobilizing financing and private capital. And while the $27 billion is a significant amount of money, we know that sort of leveraging private capital is really what's going to help us achieve, massive scale and scope of impact. So the CPI report does a really great job of thinking about some of the recommendations around mobilizing private capital. I think for the sake of this conversation, I'm going to talk a little bit around sort of opportunities to use federal funds to de-risk investments. So for decades, CDFIs have played a really instrumental role in building the capacity of markets and sometimes of entire communities to attract private capital, especially in communities that have been historically disinvested. The charter school space and the affordable housing industry, I think, are really both great examples of this work. In these markets now, traditional banks are playing and are actively involved, and that's really after sort of a significant amount of risk mitigation and capacity building efforts by CDFIs and through sort of public-private partnerships. And so I think that can be seen as a model of something we might want to emulate. I think there's several ways that the GGRF funds could be used to attract more traditional capital by de-risking. So we can think about loans in sort of a subordinate position, thinking about supporting pre-development activity, offering credit enhancements, which usually look like loan loss reserves or loan guarantees, or sort of being a little bit more creative and providing interest rate buy downs or providing collateral support, or even thinking about how to provide subsidy in securitization vehicles. I do think at the same time, CDFIs and green banks really need to reflect on sort of their own models of self-sufficiency. So how will they think about raising long-term sustainable sources of capital and sort of balance deploying this long-term, patient, low return, de-risking capital versus sort of more short-term capital that can be recycled quickly and allows them to earn more revenue and build their self-sufficiency. So that's really sort of like a tricky balance that intermediaries are going to have to think about. And I think there's sort of like solutions around that, as we think about sort of a secondary market for GGRF loans. CDFIs and green banks and other intermediaries should really be thinking about how to originate loans and sell these to private investors. The CDFI industry has issued over $1 billion in the capital markets and have already navigated some of the challenges around standardization and credit ratings and things like that, and have developed a competency in that space. Also just mentioned that through the creation of Momentum Securities, which is the first mission-driven community development investment bank, that's sort of a really great example of a partner who could potentially help to achieve some of these goals. And so, as we think about CDFIs and green banks, they really want to sort of think about the focus that they need to play on building their sort of own equity base. And that's something that my team is really sort of focused on as an intermediary lender. So how can we use GGRF funds to really support the equity and strengthen the balance sheet of these intermediaries so that they can leverage private capital? And that private capital that they attract is then going to be sort of really deeply mission aligned and in the control of these intermediaries. So I think that's ultimately something that we want to be working towards.
That's great. And I think you've taken a tack on doing that with SELF and some of your other investments. And it would be great to see many of the other institutions, and I know there's some on the line listening and watching. I'm going to shift up a little bit because I want to make sure we get to more of our questions, and I'll ask the panelists to be quick on the next set because we're gonna try to get through as many as we can. But Dan, I wanted to go to you quickly on that state and local government piece and ask you, what are the ways that we can bring in and support community development financial institutions and more broadly green banks and CDFIs in general in deploying GGRF funds coming out of the resilience development space in cities and communities and tribes. This is a question that plagues me a bit. Are there things from your view in California, but also elsewhere, that are good programs and policies that have worked, and any other pitfalls that you might think of? And try to keep your answer short, please. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll go quick. Thank you. I would say that generally endorsing what Duan was suggesting as a sort of a global way to provide technical assistance, tools, and trainings for originators. We need that. We need everybody out in the community saying, these are the projects we want to do, and we know how to stitch them together and take them to the next phase of their development. In a tough market like California, famously hard to develop, we need that local support, and we need to de-risk at the very front end. So training for that, keen to see what EPA is going to allow us to fund in that regard. But one specific program that I've come to really appreciate at iBank is through our Small Business Finance Center. We take federal money and we provide loan guarantees for small business lending in California. In California, that's up to 750 employees. So not all that small, but basically it enrolls lenders. And once those lenders are known to us and have a Bauer rating, they can go out and originate transactions. They enroll the loan in our program, and things move very quickly in many cases. We've been inserting some climate intelligence into that work through some air district relationships we have here, such that folks who have a climate project have a network of transactional facilitators that help them navigate that process. So it's a climate deal. It doesn't get any different terms, but the terms are up to 80% cover, and it's an effective and fast-moving guarantee program that I could see really working for CDFIs, potentially credit unions, and smaller commercial banks, just to get that mechanism in place. We backstop, we know the entities, they originate and they close on their own terms, and it's a relatively straightforward process from there. So a plug for that.
And kind of jumping from that back to you, Duan, for a second, and Jessel. So balancing your two positions, how do we get over some of the gaps that exist, and what are those major gaps that if you had to sort of play self CDFI, green bank kind of ecosystem versus major lender bank investor philanthropic arm, what are the ways that you would say, here's a gap and here's what we jump over, and kind of go back and forth quick, because then we'll move to our Q&A, because we've got some great questions we want to turn to. Jess, I'll turn to you first, and then Duan right after.
Sure. So I think that, we touched a little bit on sort of gaps around TA and sort of capacity building efforts and sort of what it will take for all partners to come together for that. I think I see another gap around sort of how we're thinking about financing and incentivizing workforce development and some of the target communities that we're trying to reach, and helping to support sort of community or alternative ownership models. I also see, from sort of a financing lens, a major gap in sort of pre-development products. So products that are really designed to move community-oriented projects to become shovel-ready. So products that need to address things like land acquisition, energy audits, site assessments, feasibility assessments, and really broad operating capacity. These could take the forms of things like forgivable debt or recoverable grants, but we really think that CDFIs and green banks are hopefully well situated to be able to fill the gap on some of those products.
Yeah, thank you. No, I mean, I think that there's those gaps that you mentioned, Jessel, are, pre-development, catalytic funding. I mean, again, JPMorgan Chase has supported one of our programs for gap funding, and we see how, $3 million can unlock $11 million. Our leveraging ratio is $11 to $1 federal dollar, and we raised $11 from the private sector. And I think that what we have to really remember is that GGRF is not the silver bullet solution to all, because in this climate transition, it's not just net zero. How are low and moderate income communities going to get to net zero when their roofs are falling apart? So we need additional flexible and patient capital to build the on-the-ground ecosystem, to strengthen the stock, to make it ready for net zero. So I think that this is where public-private partnerships really can play a huge, need to play a huge role. Because otherwise, GGRF funds are like, it's amazing, but at the same time, they're going to be hard to deploy. That's just a fact. And, you know, this idea that it's solving all our problems, I think is a little bit, you know, overly like color, pink color, rose color, whatever, right? So I think that we have to think about additional capital that's flexible, that can help wrap around, you know, products like resilience, roofing, water issues, in the transportation sector. We also need what Dan said at the very beginning, equity. We cannot achieve sustainability or self-sufficiency with tiny margins serving low and moderate income communities if we don't have equity. So I think there's always two conversations going on. One is standardized scale, let's do this big. Yes, let's do it. Private market will be a part of that. And then there is that 40% that's now built into the GGRF funds, thankfully, which is serving low-income communities. How do we do that? And nobody really wants to do that. That's the toughest work that we have to do. So I don't think that they are the same solutions for both of those markets. So I just want to leave that there.
Yeah. And you touch upon the larger issue that CDFIs now have to enter, which is the global sort of mitigation versus adaptation financing schemes that everybody's wrestling with, and there's not enough mitigation, and there's nothing close to being enough adaptation, and our communities that you're speaking about need both, and GGRF is just one stream of those. So we're going to turn to some of the questions so that we get to them. We've got about a little over 10 minutes left for the webinar. We're never going to get to all of them, of course. Chris, I have the first one to queue up. So did you want to jump in?
Oh, sure. If you had one specifically you're ready to ask, I was going to kind of read out a question or a couple of related questions for you to start out with, but as you prefer.
Well, and there's just one that caught my eye, because we did have a lot of conversations about this when we started talking to our interviewees, and I think it's something that all the institutions that are on the call have to reckon with, and that is, what are the roles? Thank you, Peter Adams, for throwing this out here. What are the roles that the insurance sector can play to scale up and streamline access to GGRF funds? And this isn't just GGRF, right? So given the new technologies, given the new financial products, and given the direction we need to go, given what's happening with the insurance industry, this is a question that I think that really sort of sits over the top, elephant in the room, with some of this kind of funding. So what kind of roles can the insurance sector play? And we'll just sort of start. I'll start with you, Duan. Give it a minute. Jessel, you, and then to you, Dan. Each of you just give us 30 to 60 seconds on that.
Dan, I was going to give it to you because you had your mic unmuted. So do you want to start?
Sure, that was, I'm trying to jump the queue, but I'll take less than a minute. Obviously, performance wraps on technology, anywhere that's available and efficiently priced. You know, we're looking at a lot of revenue uncertainty. So take one of the risks off the board, and if you take tech risk off the board, that's awesome. There's an interesting stream of development around insuring tax credits, the tax credit value. We'd love to work on being a bridge to federal tax credits, and if someone's prepared to work with us to de-risk some of that on an insurance product basis, that's great. And then lastly, we're seeing insurers increasingly put their sort of investment capital alongside, or potentially alongside, green banks, so that they can continue to serve markets by either improving resiliency or just getting like a reasonable rate of return on a technology or intervention that keeps the community insurable. More of that would be tremendous.
Yep. Well, I want to say some of those are very sophisticated instruments, especially if we're here for Florida, I think. But I think that insurance can play a huge role in, one, what Dan said at the end, is participating in funding and helping us improve the stock of homes that they are going to insure. So here in Florida and across the South, insurance companies are dropping people, mostly LMI households, tens of thousands every year. And people can't afford insurance, and then they can't afford to replace the roof to higher wind resistance. So would it make sense for them to invest in helping them replace those roofs through investing through green banks and CDFIs? That's one specific role. Second is also with grants and equities for the lower income, because it's probably cheaper to prevent than rebuild. And I think that the third thing is that if we had policy that with these improvements that we're going to make with GGRF funds and others, insurance costs should go down because they're reducing the risk of loss. So those would be my
Yeah,
wishes.
that's great. That's great. And holistic resilience means that you have to look at where there's already shocks and stresses hitting these populations, right? One of the major questions, and we're going to kind of lump some together here, is how are you thinking about risk related to the policy continuity at the federal level and some of the lower levels with the elections coming up, and also different policy environments across states and cities, especially when it comes to things like zonings, because there's this intersection, right, of federal policy and funding, insurance, and the financing that comes with it, and the projects are right in the middle, and you guys are kind of like triangulating all the time on that. So that's one big question. How are you thinking about that? And then a second question, and then we'll go to you and pick through these. What are some practical measures to help standardize and scale, given all the potential regulatory differences in the local environment? And these are related, right? But like, one is political, one is policy in a sense. How do those intersect? Let me start with you, Duan, and then we'll go to you, Jessel.
Yeah, well, of course, everybody's nervous about federal policies. I think that all we can do is hurry up and deploy as much as we can before anything changes. Our philosophy itself for the last 11 years has been, if you're not going to help us, just stay out of the way. And we have designed kind of policy-proof programs. What I mean by that is we want to design programs that work with or without favorable policies, that are not dependent and reliant on federal policies, that will stand on their own. This means that most likely low-income communities get left out, which is the piece that really, of course, we're very mission-driven. So the piece that worries us, because they need special help, subsidies, rebates. We cannot do this transition by putting debt on the backs of low-income people. It's just not right. It cannot be done, should not be done. So that's the part that concerns us, that would leave out that market. In terms of local, like state policies and others, local governments are the most effective in implementing policies that are favorable to our work. State governments can change whatever, but it's really at the local level that we can work most effectively. So local rebates, helping identify like that communities, etc. So I think that I feel, because we have worked in this environment for so long, we're just of the idea that work with programs that will be as policy-proof as possible. And then take advantage of policies while they're in place. That's our philosophy.
Thanks, Tuan. Jessel?
Yeah, and I think you sort of hit on a big point there, but I maybe just reiterate that I think that the cost of standardization is always sort of going to be sort of like our effectiveness of like meeting specific needs. And so I think what we need to see is sort of a broader culture of collaboration and learning and sharing of best practices of like what is working effectively in certain ecosystems and what can we replicate in different localities and states, and what ecosystem is not effective to be replicated in different environments. So like having this sort of infrastructure to be able to support that shared learning, and having participants who are willing to show up to this conversation and lean into community engagement in particular to understand what the needs are of the community engagement. How do we structure products that are, maximizing wealth creation and community ownership, and are really thinking about creating dignified jobs in communities. And so really thinking about how do we empower community stakeholders to be a part of the process all the way from implementation to evaluation, and how do we rally that information all the way upwards for our policy?
And I think, it's important to note, right, that we aren't necessarily, we're talking about big policy, right? We may not necessarily be talking about zoning or some of the sort of benchmarks that are necessary. And I think that also has to be included, right, over time, because there's a whole set of sectors who we're not even talking to right now on this call that affect what gets built, how it gets built, how it gets designed, and then there may be financing that comes with it. So with that kind of, Dan, shifting the gear a little bit to the second part of that question, what's the piece that the policy and regulations come into play for you, especially in California, but sort of imagining how do we do more with that in order to effectively build the right kinds of projects?
At the local level specifically, I think putting resources down for origination in communities fronts, like at the first moment, so that we start getting projects that have a better chance of success, either because they understand the local regulatory environment and or they know the local politics of what it takes to get something actually constructed. I'm interested to see what kind of technical assistance money can actually flow to local governments in this market building framework. We're trying to build a bunch of stuff in California, and we hear from local regulatory planning agencies, we'd love to help you, but we got like 1.5 people that they're trying to figure out how to integrate all this solar and storage. So recognize that and put resources to work at the local level. And I would just also say on the federal front, the question links to the Congressional Review Act. This is not a regulation, so it doesn't have quite that same dynamic of being clawed back under a new Congress. It could be pared back, but EPA is going to stipulate what counts as deployed capital. Once the money flows to the national entities, what has to happen next before it is effectively outside of EPA's control? There's no perfect answer to the political question, but that's the test. Get it loose from US EPA, and then the security of deployment post politics is a highly insured.
Great, thanks. So we are quickly running out of time. And rather than sort of slamming you at the very last second for a 30-second wrap up, I will say that for all the audience as well, one of the ways we wanted to wrap is for us to sort of think about as a group, what is that final sort of magic wand that you need for this to happen? And I won't put it on the panelists only, but if any of you have a sort of 30-second last words, I'll give you the opportunity to do that now, and then we'll turn it back over to the CPI team to close this out. But 30 seconds each of you. Where do we go from here?
Build for the long run. Take every opportunity to build for the long run.
Right.
And I would say, sort of, we know that the existing ecosystem is not working for sort of low income and disadvantaged communities. And we have to sort of really challenge the status quo. Can't keep playing, we're not gonna be able to play it safe. We need to stretch ourselves in our sort of relative domains of influence. And so my hope is that everyone in this forum can sort of take this as a call of action to sort of step up and to be innovative and brave and bold and really sort of tenacious and sort of a fight for a more equitable and just climate transition.
Awesome. Thanks, Jessel. Dawn, last word.
Yeah, it's kind of like Jessel. I thought if I had a magic wand, I would sprinkle wisdom on all of us so that we could properly understand the needs of every market and design the right products, find the right solutions so that no one gets left behind.
Awesome. We are right at time. Chris, over to you. Thank you so much to the panelists. What a great discussion. It went very fast. And hopefully we will continue this conversation in other locations. So thanks to all of you, and thanks to CPI.
I agree.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Stuart, and all of our panelists for that really excellent conversation. I really enjoyed it, and it was really insightful. Thank you for all of our participants for joining. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions you asked. Time was a little tight, but I really hope you all found this to be a useful and informative conversation. I certainly did. Thanks again, everyone. Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.